So today I wanted to discuss a few pros and cons as they relate to mandatory minimum sentencing after we reviewed the documentary 13th. The way that I have this video structured is that I'm going to discuss a pro in favor of mandatory minimums and then immediately discuss a con that refutes the idea of a mandatory minimum sentence. I'm sure that I'll miss some points and that other points may be made in other people's videos that I may have overlooked. And so I'm looking forward to seeing other perspectives after I review different videos. And I'm sure that some of the points that I make people will refute, which I welcome. I'm open to feedback. So I only have a few points that I wanted to make, and I really wanted to keep this video brief. So one of the first pros that I have in favor of mandatory minimum sentencing is that they can lead to an overall decrease in crime because individuals that are convicted would be forced to serve a lengthy minimum, which would then lead to a sense of safety in communities and neighborhoods, as well as a decrease in crime statistics. A lot of law enforcement agencies post their crime statistics on their websites. So the contribution of mandatory minimum sentencing would in effect decrease the crime statistics in any given neighborhood because an individual that is convicted would automatically be sentenced to a very lengthy sentence. A con, however, to that aspect of mandatory minimum sentencing is that it does not take into consideration the nature of the crime, nor does it take into consideration the person's criminal history or lack thereof. So it does not take into consideration whether it's a drug offense or a violent crime, such as in my opinion, a rape or a murder or a strong arm robbery or a brandishing of a weapon. And then as far as a person's criminal history is concerned, whether it's their very first conviction or it's their third conviction, however, that current conviction is much less, say it's a drug offense, as opposed to possibly brandishing a weapon prior, the punishment doesn't necessarily fit the crime. And so that really just contributes to an inequality of justice, in my opinion. It also does not take into consideration that individual's socioeconomic status, nor does it give the opportunity to offer rehabilitation. Say it's a person's first offense and it's a drug offense and they were selling or distributing a drug of some sort, say it's methamphetamine or cocaine, or they were caught using or they had paraphernalia on them. It does not take into consideration that that person has never been convicted of a crime before that. They have been a completely, perfectly, quote unquote, normal and model citizen, but now they have been stopped by a law enforcement officer, and the mandatory minimum sentencing doesn't necessarily fit that crime, nor does it offer the chance of rehabilitation, such as a Narcotics Anonymous class or drug rehabilitation or community service. So essentially, like I said, the punishment does not fit the crime. An additional pro in favor of the mandatory minimum sentencing is that violent offenders would be removed from the streets, again, contributing to what other community members and neighbors of those communities would consider a safer environment. And it could possibly lead to less instances of use of force among police officers because there would be less opportunities for involvement with officers because people who are deemed as criminals are already locked up for very lengthy amounts of time. However, A con to that is that that's a false sense of safety, because just because one person who is considered a criminal is locked up for a very significant amount of time does not mean that crime will go away. So that's a false sense of safety and a false sense of hope. And then another topic that came up for me while I was watching the documentary 13th is what is considered violent and who is considered violent. Because it has been abundantly clear in the news, although I don't always personally trust the news because I feel as though they have their own narrative. It has been abundantly clear that a violent criminal, when it comes to a person of color, gets treated very differently than a violent criminal that is white. Cases in point that I always lead back to are the case of Brock Turner raping a college student and only getting sentenced to 6 months in jail. And then also just last year, the case of Kyle Rittenhouse having an automatic weapon at a Black Lives Matter protest and then being bailed out and not serving any time as far as I know. I have not done current research, so that may not be accurate at this point. So I will do research after I am done creating this video. And so, in my opinion, I feel as though that aspect of violent is very subjective. Though our laws are written in black and white, there is still a lot of gray in between, and that gray has a tendency to be racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, you name it. The laws are not written in favor of people of color or people that are not white males that are living in a privileged society. So violent is really a subjective term in my opinion, especially given the fact that, to my previous point, punishments don't always fit the crimes. Another pro, and this will be my last point because I'm already going over 7 minutes, is that it would lead to quicker sentencing. So there's less time for individuals to be sitting in prison or at home waiting to be sentenced until they go and be moved to jails. But a con of that is that there removes a need for a judge, and then it also doesn't take into consideration that a good majority, as it was noted in the film 13th, of prosecutors that are chosen are of white heritage and most always male. So there is a very uneven playing field, especially when, if you look at our justice system, it targets persons of color. And it also puts a strain on the prison system, as we saw in the documentary 13th. So though there's quicker sentencing, it is leading to those individuals that are already serving sentences for what is considered less violent crimes to be released from jail or prison early. And then these individuals that are required to serve a mandatory minimum sentence to take their place and be incarcerated for much longer periods of time, putting a strain on the system. And then there's a need for more jails and more prisons. And then you have the snowball effect because many prisons or jails are now for-profit entities. So it is now becoming a business of keeping people incarcerated rather than rehabilitating. So there's really no chance for growth or opportunity. It's basically immediately just telling someone you're never going to amount to anything, you will never be better, this is who you are, this is what your community or society thinks of you, and you need to be locked up like an animal